Here we are. We're still in that DeLorean and going back in time, but we're now closer to our own time in the sense that we haven't even really talked about what it means to live in a secular age. So I got you thinking about a secular zero world, but we're going to move forward here and talk about what it would be like to live in a secular age. And the secular dawns on what we might call secular one. So it's this first kind of layer of the secular. And a way to think about this is that there becomes this kind of divide or this negotiation between what is public and what is private. Now, I'm sure you all had an aunt or your grandmother or your grandfather or a parent who told you that if you want to be a polite person, there are 4 things you should never talk about at a dinner party if you want to be polite. You remember these 4? I think they mainly hold on with us culturally. But remember, growing up, you were told you should never go to a dinner party and ask someone how much money they make. That's a very impolite thing to do. Second thing you should never talk about is you should probably never talk about politics at a dinner party. Now, that's nearly impossible today because politics has become entertainment. So what else are you going to talk about? But you were not supposed to talk about politics. The third thing, of course, you weren't supposed to talk about that I think has held on with us is that you're not supposed to talk about sex at a dinner party. Very rude thing to ask someone about their sex life at a dinner party. But then what's the 4th thing? The 4th thing you're not supposed to talk about? Religion. And why? Why are those 4 things, money, politics, sex, religion, not something you talked about? Well, those are not polite to talk about because those are all private matters. And polite people do not talk about private things in public. So this is the very arrival of the secular, when belief becomes a private thing. You can start to hear how Wendy can imagine it's possible to divide action and belief, because what she ultimately assumes for her daughter is what her daughter believes is something internal. It's something private that she holds to. Her actions are public actions. What the motivation for her public actions are privately are really none of your business. And so it goes so far, this is a little crazy if you ask me, but it goes so far for her that they're not even really her mother's business. In other words, she can work out what she believes, but what we will do is be nice to people. What we will do is be tolerant because those are public acts. This is a major transition. So now belief itself becomes a private matter. So now to be a pastor is to somehow be a public person who asks in some ways for some public manifestations of belief, but for the most part, you have to cross the boundary into people's private lives, how they privately imagine this. Again, a medieval person would never assume that. There was really no such thing as public-private. This was all blended together, and you just did these practices. You just did these things, and that happened. Now, your job is you have to somehow cross the threshold. And there is a phenomenon at play here, if you're a pastor now in a secular age, is you are dealing with the law of vampires. You know how vampires work? Where it's not as cool culturally anymore, vampires, as they used to be. Like 10 years ago, the vampire was like the height of cultural cool. What's that? Exactly right. So the mythology of the vampire is a vampire cannot enter your house unless you invite the vampire in. They cannot enter the threshold. In some sense, that's what happens when this dawns with the pastor. That people are not all that happy with you getting into their private lives unless they ask you. If they ask you in, like, I'm really struggling with my marriage, or we don't know how to make sense of our kids' issues, or whatever those might be privately for a family, they may invite you in. But if you barge your way into their private lives, they may get deeply offended. But the larger point here is that belief itself becomes more of a private matter. So we have this transition then, a transition from things being imbued with the divine force to where the kind of locus of belief becomes inside of our will. What will we will? It's not purely rational, but it is somewhat internal how you negotiate this. So let me show you a video clip that illustrates this, and I think we've seen that the sound's going to work. If it doesn't, then we do know we have issues with demons. So we'll have to deal with that. So this comes from the NewsHour. See, I'm telling you, I got my tote bag here. So this comes from another clip from the NewsHour. But you remember this day? It's hard to remember anything that happened before the pandemic. But you remember when you were at work or wherever you were doing and you got word that Notre Dame had set ablaze in Paris? Remember that? All right, so this is the news after that terrible day that it set ablaze, and they interview a woman who you'll see her here. She's like the dean of the Episcopal Chapel of Paris, and I just want you to listen to how she talks about this because it's really interesting. But I also want to be clear that I'm not showing you this because I think she's wrong. I think this is exactly how I would answer, but it's very, very different next to the work we've done around Secular Zero. And I have to tell you this because I got in so much trouble from an Episcopal bishop for showing this. It's like, did you get permission from her to show this? It's like, it's on TV. I don't think you need permission if it's on TV. It's like on PBS. Anyhow, they got mad because he got mad. It was one guy because he thought that I was like being mean to her. I'm not. I think she may be very well right, but it's a very different imagination, and that's what I want you to pick up on. So here is the interview.
Laird is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survived.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
All right, so it's almost as if I paid her to say that. But it's really profound. What does she say? Well, Jesus' crown of thorns. Is it really Jesus' crown of thorns? Well, does it really matter? I mean, what matters is the faith it invoked in people, what it did within them, the way it invoked them to pray. Now, again, she may be very well right, but it's a very different imagination. And you see how it becomes located more internal on how you negotiate this. Now, when we say this in this arrival, I mean, I know we said the secular, this becomes the arrival of the secular. So it feels like it maybe is the dissipation of belief. In many ways, this comes after Protestantism, after the arrival, after the Reformation, and it's the heightening of the significance of religious commitment. Now everyone is responsible for holding a very high bar of belief. Now when you walk into Jonathan Edwards Church, you are preached at every Sunday that every minute of your day belongs to God. So I remember one sermon from my growing up. Well, that in itself is a sad thing. I don't know what I was thinking, but like I've given my life to the church and gone through a lot of church service. And I was like a church kid, like I was there every Sunday, and I remember one sermon. And this is the sermon. It was the weird week that my Lutheran pastor preached a Jonathan Edwards sermon. And this is what he said. This is the only refrain I remember from the sermon. He said to the congregation, he said, if you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. And I remember I was probably 12, and I remember hearing this and being like, what? And I kept repeating it to myself. If you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. And I thought, I'm in 6th grade. I said, I go to a public school. I'm in school almost 7 hours a day. I hate school. All I do is waste time. It's like, I'm a time-wasting savant. Like, I have little games I play. I pass notes. It's like, oh my gosh. But this was his one Jonathan Edwards sermon in the sense that every minute of every day now is before God. You don't need anyone to mediate for this. Now you need to keep track of your own life before God. And so we have this, all these Puritan women keeping journals of every second of every day, essentially. They're just keeping track of what they're doing with their lives. So what happens here when the secular arrives, which is a really interesting story, is the bar actually gets lifted higher, not lower. Now we all are priests and we all have to live as priests. All of our own internal commitment. It's not enough just that you go to the Mass every week. You have to believe it. You have to be committed to it. And your pastor's job is to help that through the sermons, through Bible study, help that grow, but then to come demonstrate it by what you do in the congregation every week, by the way you volunteer or the way you commit to the community. So this move towards the private isn't the denigration of belief. It actually heightens it at the beginning. But you can see now that after a while, this bar is high. What happens if we just kind of lower it? What happens if internally I don't really feel like I need to believe this? Now, this also becomes the period where the denomination becomes pretty significant. And the American denomination starts to kind of filter through all sorts of different Western ways we organize ourselves. And here's the thing that every denomination knows, whether they can kind of live out of it or not, is every denomination has known for 300 years that it can only exist for one more generation. Now, let me be clear about that. That doesn't mean every denomination will only exist for one more generation, but it means that inside of this kind of transition, the next generation has to make a willful decision to enact their lives in this denomination, or it will not exist. So there will be no more evangelical Lutheran Church in America if the next generation does not decide that they will enact their lives as ELCA Lutherans. If they don't, it won't exist. So you need every next generation to renew the denomination, or it doesn't happen. It will not exist. So this has become, of course, a big existential issue for most of our denominations, and at least in a lot of the denominations I know, and in the ELCA, one of the ways we make sure that this will continue is we put a lot of money, relatively speaking, into an every 3-year youth gathering, it's called. So all the high school age young people, do your denominations do that? I know the PCUSA has a triennium and things like that, where every 3 years come, it's a big kind of gathering of kids within the denomination. Well, the Lutherans do pour a lot of money in this. And if you look at their church-wide budget, everything in the last decade has been cut in half, 75% loss on almost every budget line, except the every 3-year youth gathering. That's lost a little bit of money, but for the most part, it's kept its funds. And I think it has kept it because they know if the next generation does not enact their lives this way, this denomination doesn't exist. So every 3 years, they gather. A few years ago, I was at one. It was in New Orleans. Yeah, New Orleans or San Antonio. San Antonio. It was in San Antonio, and I happened to be, it's like day 2, and you know these things, it's like in a dome, and there's all these speakers, and at this one, there's like 15,000 Lutherans from all over the country, and it's great 3-4 days of excitement. And I happened to end up being creepy guy listening to high school girls talk. I didn't mean to, but I was walking down the hallway and these 2 girls were in front of me and I was trying to kind of get around them, and they were having so much fun. I mean, they were just, this event was so great for them and they were loving it. And they were kind of teasing each other, and then they were walking side by side, and one did that thing where you kick your friend, you know, like that. And it was all in fun and games, and the girl got kicked. And at least in my memory, they're from California. And I don't know that they were really from California, but it's much more fun to tell this story if they're from California like this. So the girl got kicked, and she looked at her friend, and she goes, "Oh my gosh, like, I can't just believe you just kicked me." And then she said this, and it stopped me in my tracks. She goes, "I can't believe you just kicked me. That is such an un-Lutheran thing to do." And it literally stopped me in my tracks. And I just stood there and went, "Un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing to do?" Like, she didn't say, "Hey, that's a really unbiblical thing to do," or "That's an un-Christian thing to do." She said, "That's an un-Lutheran thing to do." And I thought to myself, if she would have put her arm around her friend and said, "Hey, listen, we're hearing all this stuff about justification by faith alone, but I want you to know your works really matter," that would have been very un-Lutheran. Like, that would have been very, very un-Lutheran thing to do. But that's not what happened here. She got kicked, and she says, "That's a very un-Lutheran thing to do." And it testified that exactly what they wanted with this millions of dollars they had poured in had worked. This girl had tried on for at least 3 or 4 days, who knows if it would last, seeing the world as a Lutheran. That's why they were putting the money into it. Would it mean that she would see her life that way in a week or a month? Who knows? But you better try, or else what does the denomination do? Point being, it's really a deep sense of what do you think? It becomes internal. Again, it's not just purely rational, but there is a kind of sense of what you consent to, what you hold to. Second element that happens in secular one is you get a transition, and you get a transition from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. The best way to illustrate this is, this also was before the pandemic, so it may be hard to remember, but some of you, of course, remember this. This was January 31st, 2018. Do you remember this? Most of you do, even with the pandemic, because you were never more busy in your life as a pastor because of this date. Remember, like the week before this, your calendar was so full. The week after this, your calendar was incredibly full. This is probably the busiest you've been over this 2-week period. Remember that? No, none of you do. You all have a blank look on your face because none of you were busy. This was when there was the super red blood moon. Remember that? Okay, my guess, you can tell me if you are the outlier on this, but none of you had a full schedule of pastoral care calls because of the super red blood moon. No one called and said, Pastor, I just really need to talk right now because I heard there's going to be a super red blood moon. And, we're thinking, I just applied for a job. I just got offered a new job, and it's in Houston. And now that there's a super red blood moon, does God want me to take the job in Houston or not? Or, Pastor, we've been trying to have a baby, but now there's a super red blood moon. Should we have a baby or not? No one did that. No one needed you to discern the natural phenomenon and what its meaning was behind it. When you live in a cosmos, you assume that. When you live in a cosmos, even the natural phenomenon has a message to it. And it needs someone to help you discern what this means. When you live in a universe, well, we know what this is. We have equations that can tell us when the next one is going to come. Don't get me wrong, this is Instagrammable. You should get out there at 4 a.m. and, get this on your Instagram. But there's not a sense that there's a larger message in it, that there's something that there's a story in here that you have to find. So the pastor no longer is even interpreting natural phenomenon. Again, you see how it becomes more internal than external. Where in a secular zero, and again, you can see how this could be incredibly abused. The pastor's job was to even interpret the natural phenomenon. Why the crops were growing or why they weren't. How our obedience was leading to this phenomenon or that phenomenon. But now we don't really assume those things once we enter into a secular one. So we could see secular one then as a transition in kind of pastoral practice from access to really demonstrate. How do you help people demonstrate publicly what is true internally? So the quote unquote, and this is in quotes, the best pastor is the one who gets people to demonstrate this. And that's in some sense what church becomes about. Church becomes about demonstrating what is internal, external. And what you're doing with your preaching and your teaching is to impact people internally and help them demonstrate that externally. Make sense? Let me take this one more step, and then we're going to get you to talk about this around your tables. So what happens is secular one is here, and one of the points that Charles Taylor is making, and some of you know that I'm building this off the Canadian philosopher, who I'll say a little bit more about next session. Once this arrives, it never goes away. This is here. Every kind of Western society that sees itself as secular in some ways, that organizes its institutions that way, will have something like this divide. Now, that it is really true that the way India has worked this out is quite different than the way the West has worked it out, but it starts to kind of take a form like this. So once it's here, it's here. So we all are secular one people in some way or another. But there is a way that this starts to take another form, a form that's built off of this, but starts to take another form. And I think this is really where we're at today, where this can kind of evolve into what we might call secular two. So if secular one is a public-private divide, secular two almost radicalizes that. It becomes a more of a competition, a head-on collision. And it becomes a real conversation almost around loyalty in some sense, or what will you commit to?
I am curious, a couple of things. First of all, as I look at this, in these different eras, different groups tell the time, right? And so I'm thinking, in our own era, when you think about, the Muslim faith, right? And so the 5 calls to prayer tell the time. How does the time teller shift in this? Who tells the time in each of these areas, and why does that matter?
Yeah. It's I think it is very true that that in a secular world, the church doesn't keep time anymore. And we think about church bells. If you're in Europe, and you're walking a European village and the church bells go, we forget those church bells are for 2 reasons. One, it's to keep time and keep everyone on time. The bells keep demons away. We tend not to remember that, but that is part of the bells are to keep the evil away. But that is one of the things that happens in secular zero, is that the church keeps time. And I think one of the moves of a modern world that allows this public-private divide is the public reality, and therefore who keeps time becomes disconnected from the church. So really who kind of keeps time at this period becomes, in the very arrival of secular one, who keeps time is the state. In many ways, the state keeps time. And when secular two arrives, I think really what keeps time is the market. The market keeps time. And that, in many ways, is what we feel. I think some people would even say in this room, okay, you don't know where I'm going to go, so let's see what happens there. But you could even push back at me. It's like, well, this is really naive. I mean, tell us it's not a secular two issue, but how are we going to pay the bills? And fewer people means, weaker institutions. And so aren't you going to keep time on the market? Like, the market is making a decision here. And again, I don't want to be naive about that, but that also is a very interesting thing that we have to face here, that we have this assumption. Another way to look at this is what inside belief, we can think of this as belief, we could also think of this as the church, is what stabilizes it. And we tend, working backwards now again, inside a market that keeps time, what stabilizes any institution across the modern project, across modern institutions? The only thing we know that really stabilizes them is growth. Growth stabilizes. How do you know your company is going to exist in the next 5 years? If it grows. How will, the only thing we actually think doesn't have to grow to continue, well, it's a big divide in our countries. We're not sure the government needs to grow. I mean, there's a group of us who think that we need to shrink that baby down so we can drown it in a small bathtub before, that. And now we're not going to go any further politically in that. Other than to say the justification for shrinking the government is to allow the market to grow. So even when you justify that, the moral reality of why we need a smaller government is because we need a smaller tax footprint so that we can allow people to have more access to the market for themselves, say. So this question, this is what, again, to quote Hartmut Rosa, this is what he calls dynamic stabilization. So the way any institution in the modern world gets stabilized is by its growth, its continued growth. But there's an insidious problem with this. So let's say you have a company, say you sell ice cream, and you have a 30% growth. Well, now you're investable. And now people are very interested in you. But what you don't do after you realize from looking at the numbers that you've grown by 30% is you don't have a meeting and say, wow, we grew 30%. Next year, let's only try to grow 5%. Let's have a down year of 25. If we have a down year of 25%, we're still up 5%. Isn't that good? No. Once you grow 30%, next year you need to equal that, if not grow more. And so you can never get off the growth accelerator, ever. And if you do, think about the way that the market works. If you just pay your bills, you just plateau, you need to sell your company for parts. No one wants to invest in a company that's growing at 2 or 3 or 4%. You need to get yourself over 15%, or what's the point of this? Now, again, there are logics inside of this that are worth considering, but when we transpose those onto what it means to be a good church, what it means to be a good pastor, that becomes very different. Now, the best pastor keeps the best time by growth. And so what stabilizes a Protestant American congregation is that it's growing in some way. No medieval person would have ever imagined that. What stabilized the church, and again, we should not be naive that this couldn't get corrupted, but were the practices themselves. You did the Mass. It didn't matter if no one showed up for the Mass. I mean, it would. People would be concerned that the devil had gotten a hold of everyone, but you would do the Mass. You do the Mass. The Mass needs to be done. Now we feel like we're doing this practice, but no one's coming. I guess maybe it's not worth doing. Maybe the market has spoken. There's no value in this. We tend to, at our seminary, lose the tape of this, that we tend to, whether explicitly or implicit, we tend to say that the best pastor will be the entrepreneur that can win some form of growth. And so we start to even use logics or metaphors of what a pastor does. So what I would say is really inside of the secular too where we are is that the market sets terms for this, but the deepest expression of the market right now, if that makes sense, is a kind of a Silicon Valley logic. So the winner of the market right now is the person who can come up with an idea and scale it to be a unicorn. Everybody wants to come up with the app that turns it into $1 billion idea. You want to figure out the next DoorDash. You want to figure out the next Uber. Now that just gets transposed into the pastor. The best pastor will be the one who comes up with whatever, maybe it's not legitimately an app, but it's some kind of way to win that.
The innovation, basically.
The innovation, that the entrepreneur, yeah.
And how does the state determine time now?
Yeah, so I don't think that the state necessarily keeps time now. I think this is one of the things that occurs in the late 20th century as the state as a timekeeper gets overthrown and the market takes over. I think particularly that happens in the 80s, where the 80s, the rise of kind of neoliberal kind of capitalism becomes the business is more important. I mean, this gets us into, I don't know you all that well, so I'm trying to tread this, but you can see that before the early 1980s, the businessman was never a hero in our culture. Since the 1980s, the businessman is a kind of cultural hero. It maybe should be, I don't know. I'm just saying that that's a very different reality. Most young people would much rather, most of them are, these campus pastors who are the folks, their young people are much more interested in starting their own business than ever running for any political office. Or having a kind of life of service to the civic good, and that points to something that's at stake within that. So I think that one of the things that happens really after 1968 is really where it starts to happen, is that we start to realize the timekeeper of the state cannot be trusted. So, I mean, there's a really interesting argument that Foucault makes about this, where he says, well, if you want to look at power, you have to look at how punishment is bestowed. So when you go back to secular zero, the person who bestowed punishment was the sovereign, the king, or the queen. And that was done publicly. So the king spoke for God, and particularly in their realm of giving punishment. So when Anne Boleyn is taken out to the middle of the square and her head is cut off in front of everybody, it's a public act. And Foucault's point is after the French Revolution and as this goes, we move into what he calls disciplinary power instead of sovereign power into disciplinary power. And the apparatus of punishment becomes the state. The state says, well, we'll punish for you. I mean, it's all us, right? We the people. But we'll do the service of we'll punish for you. And really, in many ways, you don't need to be punished because we're all citizens. And but if one of you as a citizen is out of bounds, like you steal someone's other property or whatever, then we'll come in and punish for you. But we'll do that in a way that you really don't see it. But this is one of the things that Black and brown communities have told us for a long time, is that the state always said, hey, we're just serving you with our punishment. We're not doing anything wrong. And what Foucault's point was, no, the state decides on who is an actual noble citizen. And then in the shadows, it essentially tortures people. And this is one of the things that we've, I think, realized since George Floyd and others, is that communities of color have said no. Like, we drive through neighborhoods and we're being watched all the time or whatever. And the response of those imposing that power is, well, you're being paranoid. And it becomes harder, say, for white communities to see that, because they're like, well, we don't see it. The punishment isn't bestowed in the public square. This is one of the things that happens because of the cell phone in George Floyd, is all of a sudden the punishment is in front of all of us, and we have to become aware of it. And so, but what Foucault says, I'm sorry, this is a little bit too much of a thesis, but the next move, and this happened he's writing these lectures just as he dies. So this disciplinary power still exists, still there. It's like, we have these areas where we torture people away from public eye, like Guantanamo Bay or something like that. The state has done that. But what happens after the 1980s is the apparatus of punishment still exists at the state level, and our communities of color have made us aware of that. But one of the things that really happens that we all live under is that it becomes turned in on us. And what I mean by that is the way neoliberal capitalism functions is we punish ourselves. So the market is wide open to you. You can do whatever you want. You can be the most unique self you want to be. Your whole future is there. If you don't get it, who's to blame? You're to blame. You failed yourself. You could have done it. So the very apparatus of punishment, Foucault says, and this is a really interesting point, he's like, this is a crazy system, that we end up punishing ourselves. It's your fault. You could have done more. You should have finished the degree. Well, you had that idea for that app. You should have done it. Why didn't you do it? You can't be mad at someone else because they did that. So we become the very apparatus of our own punishment. He calls this biopolitics, where we start to blame ourselves for this. And so you see the kind of the movement away. The state's still there. Don't get me wrong, and it still does that. And these communities have made us very aware of that. But we also then live, this is part of what these campus pastors are telling us. Like, young people are living with this sense of kind of biopolitics, and it's like, well, I don't know. Could I study English literature and just for the sake of reading, or I for sure better have a business minor, or what's the point? That's, I think the last video was pointing at that.